Yes, score. So Shelly brought the car over by tow truck, as you saw. So got a very, very busy Memorial Day weekend. I'm actually backed up like 2 months, believe it or not. But wanted to make time for this one because I know you guys are following along. And we want to solve the mystery of these mysterious, apparently forced coolant leaks that are happening with this Ford Escape here. So to very quickly recap, a couple months ago I did a water pump on this thing. There was coolant under the vehicle, the owner said. I did a pressure test right there in their driveway, found the water pump was leaking, and then I had to go off to fly to some other states for work, so I was unavailable for a while. They said soon after I repaired the water pump, they sprung a leak in a heater hose or something, had that fixed at a shop. Soon after that, radiator sprung a leak. After I get back from my trip, of course, my thinking is, yeah, probably missed it before, even though I checked for it, but it probably has a blown head gasket, building up a lot of pressure in the cooling system, and of course, finding the weakest link and forcing these leaks. In the last video, however, as you guys saw, it was pretty overwhelmingly evident there was no head gasket issue or any kind of combustion chamber compromise to the cooling system that we could find at all through a leak down test, rather extensive one. So we had to end the video there because I was out in the field and didn't really have all my stuff with me. But now we've got the car in my garage. We've got all of our technology and tools at our disposal. So we're going to figure out what's wrong. And unfortunately, there's going to be a little bit of an anticlimactic thing to this because I believe just in pulling the car into the garage, remember in the last video we didn't drive it, in pulling the car into the garage, I think I know what's wrong with the vehicle. I think we got a little bit misled. A lot of very good comments in the first video pointing out some different causes for overheat conditions, but remember, we didn't have an overheat condition. The owner stated that there wasn't an overheat with the vehicle. It just keeps popping leaks all the time, thus my thinking the blown head gasket, it's forcing the leaks before we see an overheat. However, I believe after driving this car just up my driveway, I believe that was erroneous information. I believe what's causing these leaks is actually overheating. So we also need to make absolutely sure we don't have any other damage from an overheat condition. I believe we're going to find an overheat condition, and I'll explain why in a minute. But some very good comments on looking at things that could cause overheat, or the fans working, is the thermostat stuck closed, things like that. Of course, I wasn't looking at an overheat condition. What I was looking at was a condition that would cause leaks to form from an abnormally high pressure. So things like, radiator cap somebody brought up, things like that. Obviously, problem with the combustion chamber, compromise to the cooling system, head gasket would certainly cause that. But again, without an overheat condition. So that's kind of the direction we were going, and I believe it was the wrong direction. I think what we're going to find here is that the engine is overheating. The reason I think that is because when, as you saw, the tow truck driver had to drop off the car in the street. It's a brand new subdivision. They're doing a lot of home building, so we've got a lot of heavy equipment in the streets, and the tow truck driver just wasn't able to really maneuver past that. So I just had him drop it off in the street, and then I drove the car into the garage. And while driving the car into the garage, I noticed it was very underpowered for what it should be. It just felt like the engine was really lugging and overloaded. And what I believe we're going to find here is a clogged exhaust, probably a melted catalytic converter, something like that. And it's causing the engine to run hotter because it's under higher load. And the overheat, I believe, is then forcing these leaks, and the owner just isn't noticing the overheat. Maybe the coolant temperature gauge isn't working properly, but that's kind of more the direction we're going to go. Given that, we're still back to the original square when I replaced the water pump, where one of my concerns is, hey, if there was a leaking water pump, engine's losing coolant, did it overheat and could there have been damage? So we still want to check for that, but we have a definitive direction. So sorry, it's a little anticlimactic there, and we're not going to have this big mystery. I'm pretty sure Pretty sure that's what it's going to be. So what we are going to do is a couple things. One of them is, of course, I want to see, can we get the engine to overheat? So we're going to hook it up and check the engine temperature while the engine is running. While doing that, we're going to do another trick that I'll often do, and some viewers brought it up. I'm going to hook up the pressure gauge that we were using to find leaks, and I'm just going to leave the pressure gauge on and see what the cooling system pressure builds up to while the engine's running, so that we can confirm the suspicion that we're one way or another getting a higher pressure. So we will do that. Before we do that, I got to fix whatever the problem was with my stamp pressurizing system, though. And then while the engine's running, I also wanted to do something that we really should do in the first video. We should have done that sizzle test. If you guys follow the channel, the sizzle test is a really good indication if you've got a head gasket problem or anything that would cause coolant to enter the oil system in the car. So head gasket compromised with, something with the combustion chamber, at a cooling jacket, something like that. And what you do is you just take a little bit of the engine oil, you drop it onto a really hot surface. If there is water in the oil, it'll sizzle. You'll see it and hear it sizzle. And if there's no water in the oil, it's just going to smoke a lot. And it's actually an amazingly reliable test to see if somehow we missed something with the leak down test. So we're going to do that, and I've got a whole bunch of things written on the board over here I'm looking at that we can do to verify chemical tests, things like that. I did the chemical test, though. I just didn't show it on camera. Maybe we'll do it again just for the camera here. And then I think we're going to find a clogged exhaust as our culprit here. So let's get this engine started and let's get some data off of it while it's warming up. All right, the first thing we're going to do is, of course, as always, going to establish our baselines. The first thing we want to do is make sure that we do not have any leaks in this system. That is the very first step. And I figured out what's wrong with my pressure gauge. Just had a dirty gasket, so it wasn't sealing. Yeah, that's much better. So now we're building up some pressure on here. We'll give you a look in a minute when I get it pumped up. All right, I've put about 16 pounds of pressure in the system. And what we're going to do is let this sit for about 3 minutes or so, and then we'll come back and see what it looks like. Okay, if we look at our gauge here, we can see that it moved probably about half a PSI or so. So that's really good. What this is telling us is that the system is sealed. We do not have any active leaks in this system. If we had seen, for example, the gauge had dropped rapidly like that, I'm just doing that by releasing the tension, or over the course of 3 minutes or so, we see that it drops several PSI. What that means is we're losing coolant somewhere in the system. That could be internal in the engine, could be external from the engine, so we would look around for leaks, see if the heater core might be leaking. Wet, damp carpets with coolant would indicate that. But we would go around finding the leak. We do not have an active leak that we can detect at 16 PSI at least. Now what we want to do is something different. What I want to do is put this back on, actually. So we're going to do the exact opposite, actually. What we're going to do now is we're going to set this gauge up at 0, and we're going to start the engine, and we're going to see what it builds up to with the engine running, and see if my suspicion that we're getting a very high pressure buildup that's causing the leaks to be forced. This is going to tell us that, so instead of us pressurizing the system, we're going to read what the system pressurizes to. The other thing, too, of course, is radiator cap. The radiator cap is brand new. That came with the radiator. It actually doesn't go on the radiator itself. It actually goes onto the reservoir. But the radiator cap's new, so we're not worried about that. I do want to see what the pressure builds up to. So let me make sure we're clear here. And go ahead and start the car up. Okay, so we'll let the car warm up fully. And then what I also want to do is get a temperature reading so that we can keep track of the temperature. All right, we've had this engine warming up for a little bit. Let's look at some data we got here. So the first thing is we're not getting a whole hell of a lot of pressure building up in the system quite yet. Now a lot of that is that the engine's just idling, so it's not really under a heavy load. You can see in the top left corner the engine temperature at 217. Fans are operating. They just came on a bit ago, as they normally would at this temperature. So at idle, at least, we're holding pretty good, and I can't get it to overheat. Of course, it would be a whole different situation if we were actually driving this car, especially in its conditions. Also pulled up some oxygen sensor data here. So you can see we've got fixed oxygen sensors kind of flatlined. Let me bring up the RPM a little bit. And when I bring up the RPM, you're going to see that we clearly don't have catalytic converter activity, and the oxygen sensors are going to come to life. Also, listen to the engine when I do this. You hear that whistling, and maybe you can hear the labored engine. So very clearly, we've got a restricted flow across these oxygen sensors. Pretty soon you're going to see those are going to stabilize on the sensor 1. And then also you can tell from the sensor 2, of course, that we've got no catalytic activity on either cat. So very, very strong evidence. We've got an exhaust restriction here. All right, I just gave it about a minute or so, and we can see again that we're flatlined on our O2s again, indicative of a restriction, because we can see that we can wake them up. So it's not an O2 sensor failure. A lot of people are going to look at that, if they even did, and they're going to replace O2 sensors on this vehicle. This vehicle does not need pre or post-cat O2 sensors. They work fine. They are accurately reporting the condition. Let's take another listen when I increase the RPMs here. All right, take a listen here. All right, now clearly you can hear that whistling sound. And that whistling sound sounds to me like it's coming from the DPFE. Again, this is a Ford, so we've got the DPFE there, which makes very easy for exhaust back pressure examination. But also listen to the muffled sound that the engine makes. It's kind of a muffled sound. Very characteristic. And that whistle's definitely coming from DPFE. I think what I'm going to do is disconnect it, and we're going to take a pressure reading there. We should have no back pressure really on the DPFE. And, oh, wow, holy smokes. All right, well, you can hear it. And there's that whistling sound. All right, confirmed 100%. Just unplugging the DPFE, and the back pressure is massive on that. So we've got a rather significant exhaust restriction on this car, for sure. If we were to maintain an increase in the RPMs, I'll bet we get this thing to heat up pretty good. So let's try that. And one of the things I want to do is I want to see, do we have a DPFE voltage that we can pull on this car? Oh, I'm just in generic mode here. You know, it's really not necessary. I think that was pretty self-evident, but I bet we'd have a pretty high voltage on that if we wanted to look at it that way, and if it wasn't that serious. But that's a pretty significant back pressure that we've got. So I'm pretty sure our cats are clogged, both of them, on this vehicle. What I'm going to do is try to increase RPM for a little bit. All right, don't really need an RPM gauge up here, but I'm just going to put it anyway. See the effect on the temperature. Look at the effect it's having on our coolant pressure. Just after a minute or so, it's increased quite a bit. All right, got it up to 225 again. You can hear the fans really kick in, trying to keep it down. Again, this would be a totally different story if we were driving the car, I'm sure, and I really don't want to drive it. You know, the exhaust back pressure is a proven point, but another thing, I wonder if we can pull up manifold air pressure. We don't have it here, but that's another way we could confirm. But obviously an exhaust restriction here. Okay, so what we can say for certain is we have an exhaust restriction on this car. What we cannot say for certain, though, is that it is definitely from the catalytic converters, although it always is, but we need to be thorough, especially with the expense associated with catalytic converters. I believe we need 2 of them on this car. So one possibility, it could be the muffler, or somehow some other part of the exhaust is clogged and the catalytic converters are perfectly fine, and that the clog is actually at the back of the car at the muffler. More likely the catalytic converters are clogged. So we need to determine 100% whether it's the catalytic converters or the muffler or something else. So what we're going to do is very simple. We actually only need 1 measurement for this, but I'm going to do 2 just to demonstrate. What we need to do is measure the back pressure after the catalytic converter. If the back pressure after the catalytic converter is pretty much 0, we know the obstruction is in front of that. In other words, it is the catalytic converter to the engine where the obstruction is. We can also confirm that, as we just did, by looking at the back pressure between the engine and the catalytic converter, and by removing the DPFE, we saw clearly that there was obstruction there. But if there is no obstruction after the catalytic converter, we know the catalytic converter is the choke point. So what I'm going to do is hook up a pressure gauge. We're going to look at the back pressure after the catalytic converter and see what it measures. Okay, what we're looking at is the back pressure between the catalytic converter and the muffler. So we know the muffler is not the choke point here. So obviously the catalytic converter is the point where we have the obstruction. What I'm going to do here, just to prove it, we're going to get the oxygen sensor out. Let's see if I can just do this while the car's running. Probably be a little bit noisy, I bet. Okay, we've got this little homemade adapter. Ow, that exhaust is hot. And very quickly we're going to get a measure in front of the catalytic converter here. Let's see what we get. And you can see that we have measurement of about 2 psi. That is 2 psi too many. And actually, I'm sure it'll be more if I get a good seal here. Yeah, it's starting to build up closer to 3. Let me go ahead and increase the RPM, see what it goes up to, but I'm pretty sure it's just going to blow the hose right off the adapter. Yeah, it just blew the hose right off the adapter, and there's a tremendous amount of back pressure here. So confirm this catalytic converter for sure is clogged. I'm going to go ahead and repeat this on the other side off camera, but I already know I'm going to find the same thing. What we are going to do is one more test here to see if we've got any evidence of head gasket or combustion chamber problem. Again, right now everything was negative with leak down test, with relative compression test, with a physical compression test. Let's try one more. Okay, believe me, I totally recognize this setup looks pretty sus here, but it's actually probably not that far removed from a day in the life of the person I learned this little trick from. But what I've set up here is a couple of oil samples. We've got regular oil here, just plain motor oil. Here I've got the same motor oil, but with just a tiny, tiny amount of water that I added to it. You can see they look completely identical. Can't tell the difference between them. And what we're going to do is take the regular motor oil, Just put a little bit of it onto this aluminum foil. We're going to heat it up, and let's take a look at what happens. You can see it just smokes pretty much, kind of tries to get out of the way of the flame a little bit. But it just smokes pretty much. Nothing eventful. Now, let's do that with my motor oil that's contaminated with just a little water. You can't even see that there's any water in it, but watch what happens when I apply the heat now. Hear it? And you can see it sizzling and splattering everywhere. And you can measure that contamination pretty easily. So what we're going to do is we've confirmed that our sizzle test still works. It always does. And we're going to do a sizzle test on the motor oil from the engine. All right, for more information on this test and some similar head gasket tests that are, kind of a little off the wall, you should see my video, 12 Ways of How to Test for a Blown Head Gasket. But what we've got here is the oil that I pulled from the dipstick after pulling a few dipstick draws from the engine and collecting it. Let's go ahead and put some heat here and see what happens. And look at that. The oil just smokes, kind of gets out of the way of the flame, no sizzling. This engine doesn't have a blown head gasket. What I'm going to do is probably just drive the car a little bit, verify that I get it over temperature, and that'll be confirmation enough for me that that's what our problem is. All right, well, that was actually pretty helpful. I can tell you, I wanted to film this for you guys, but I really needed to pay attention to the temperature gauge and stuff because I want to make absolutely sure I don't overheat the engine and blow it, knowing that the engine is in good condition here. But what I can tell you is after driving the car just 7 or 8 minutes, I was able to get the temperature up to about 230 degrees, and that was enough for me. I didn't drive it around with my pressure gauge connected on there for obvious reasons, but I am pretty sure that at that temperature the pressure is going to build up and, of course, start forcing leaks at the weak link. So I believe we've solved our problem. We've got a exhaust clog on this car, and it's causing the engine to overheat. So the information that I got that the car was not overheating was inaccurate. And, a lot of times people, they're different than when you're trying to fix the car. They aren't really noticing things like that. So I actually pretty frequently find that happens, that when I ask people if certain things are happening, they'll say no, but then I come to find out that they are. But of course, I'm looking for it. I know what I'm looking for. Your typical car owners, of course, aren't really paying attention to things like that. They're just trying to get to work or whatever. So what we're going to need to do for this car is get a couple of catalytic converters installed, unfortunately. And once we do that, we have to repeat these tests, make sure that while driving the car, it stays at the correct temperature. Check that our cooling system stays under the correct pressure, and I do believe that that's all that we've got wrong here. So what I'm going to do is call the owner right now. Hey, it's Shelly, so she knows we're filming. Let me call them up right now, and let's see what happens. Let's see what she says.
Hey, Matt.
Hey, Shelly, how you doing?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm doing good. Well, I got some good news and bad news, I guess.
Bad news first.
Bad news first. Okay, that's fine. The bad news is the problem with your car is you have 2 clogged catalytic converters. It's causing the engine to be overloaded, and it's creating the pressure on that cooling system that is causing those leaks to happen. That means that it's going to be approximately a $1,500 repair. Yeah.
Yeah, that's bad news.
That's bad news. That's bad news. The good news is that it's the only thing I find wrong. I am absolutely 100% convinced you do not have a major engine problem. You do not have a head gasket failure. There is no question about that. I do believe the only thing wrong is the catalytic converters. Just wanted to give you the information.
Okay. What's the good news?
Well,
You told me there was good and bad. What's the good?
that's funny. I guess that isn't really very good news. Well, the good news is we figured out what's wrong, I guess, is the good news. But
Okay.
yeah, the catalytic converters would be special order, so it would probably take 5 or 6 days to even get them in, so I wouldn't even be able to do it this weekend, but probably gives you enough time to talk with Rocky about what your plans are, or maybe you have one in mind. I think you already do anyway, but because I know you're not too thrilled with this car. Yeah, it's going to be at least 1,500 and no more than 1,700 or 1,800, I would say. But that's what we're looking at.
Okay, and I really don't think this is even an option, but you would, if we did decide to have the work done, which we're not going to, but if we did, you would be replacing both of the catalytic converters?
That is correct. Both of your catalytic converters are clogged.
Okay, all right. All right, Matt. Well, I appreciate the call. And unfortunately, I guess, does that mean, like, the car's going to be sitting at your house for a while? Like, you don't want it there.
Well, I guess it'll be sitting here until you make a decision either way. It's either going to drive out of here with a set of new cats, or it's going to go off again in a tow truck, I suppose. But one way or another, I can hang on to it for a few days, certainly for the weekend, until you think about it.
Okay, so we wouldn't be able to drive it from your house, like it still has to be towed, right?
No, I drove it around and it really lacks power. And the other thing too is that it started to overheat on me after about 9 minutes. I don't think you're going to make it home. And the other problem is if you did try to drive it, well, now all bets are off, because if you drive it and you overheat it, well, then of course you're likely to damage the engine, and then we're back to square one. Right. Yep. If you don't repair it, it's going to have to go off in a tow truck.
Okay.
All righty. Well, give me a call when you think about it.
I will. Thanks, Matt. I appreciate it.
You're welcome. Talk to you later.
All right.
Bye.
Bye.
All right. I will update you guys on what happens.